Okay, we should be live, allegedly. Hey guys. Sorry this is coming up significantly later than expected. I got home from Ryder, what's it like now, 9:30? I got home from Ryder about 10, 15 minutes ago. We are going to be doing a lot of material tonight, just candidly. We have to talk about the American Revolution. We have to do all of the French Revolution. We have to talk about Napoleon. And then we have to talk about Haiti. All in one go. Isn't that fun? Yeah. Anyway, let's power through this, shall we? So in our last class, in the last episode of History Ball Z, we talked about the Enlightenment. We talked about Adam Smith. We talked about how Adam Smith really sort of kills the concept of mercantilism, sort of throws it out, throws the key away, and sort of enters a brave new world. The thing is, with Adam Smith, stop Stavros, I just see you right now. The thing is, with Adam Smith, we kind of see the political impact of the Enlightenment almost immediately. I would argue that the American War of Independence is, by far, the first political impact of the Enlightenment that you see almost immediately. The thing is, while the Enlightenment is impacted, while the American Revolution is impacted by the Enlightenment, I wouldn't say necessarily that's the cause. In fact, if you wanted to point to one origin event, one story that will help us understand the French Revolution and the American Revolution, it's this event. Okay? It is the 7 Years' War. Not the 30 Years' War, the 7 Years' War. So here's the thing with the 7 Years' War. It's fundamentally uninteresting. It's a war that's fought, at least in Europe, over some dynastic dispute. You don't need to remember that. What you need to remember is that fundamentally what the 7 Years' War ended up being about was colonies, colonial control. What do I mean by that? So, if you, hypothetically speaking, you're not 21, and you want to do something fun for your birthday before turning 21, chances are you'll get in your car. Yeah, I'm doing this from the Rutgers area, and if you drive about 6 hours north, you'll end up in a beautiful city called Montreal. You should go visit if you haven't. It's really fun. It's a good time. Speaking from experience. The thing is, they don't speak English in Montreal. Or at least they don't want you to think they speak English. They speak French. Because that's right, that whole part of Canada was originally a French colony. Right? The colony of Quebec was originally all French. It's a French-speaking territory. Whereas the 13 colonies were English-speaking. So let's play a game of geography, shall we? I want you to imagine the east coast of the United States and the east coast of Canada in your head. If you follow the Lawrence River south and west, that would be the natural path of expansion for French colonists to keep going, right, into the Great Lakes and beyond. And for the British colonists, what you would end up having is a path of expansion that goes just purely westward. You see where I'm going with this? So you have a path of expansion that's going sort of, I'm trying to do this in a sort of mirrored format. This is east for you. This is west for you. Got it. Okay. I'm smart, I promise. So if you're a British colonist, you're going westward. And if you're a French colonist, you're going southwestward. You'll see that these lines eventually meet up. French expansion in North America and British expansion in North America are increasingly mutually exclusive. It's either or. And the place where these two lines meet is, in my opinion, one of the worst places on earth. A place where goodness goes to die, where nothing of any quality comes out of. I'm speaking, of course, of Ohio. That's right. The 7 Years' War is fundamentally fought over Ohio and the Ohio Valley. And it's not just Ohio. It's control of the West. It's control of the West. Because if you control the Ohio Valley, that brought you to the Mississippi. If the French had won the 7 Years' War, spoilers, they would have been able to connect their colony in Louisiana up the Mississippi with their colony in Louisiana and sort of encircle the English colonies. That's why the 7 Years' War is so important. But since they speak English in Ohio, barely, you can gather that the British won the 7 Years' War. Now, fundamentally, that's actually the least important thing about the 7 Years' War. What you need to remember about the 7 Years' War is that it maybe wasn't the bloodiest war in the world, but it was, up until this point, history's most expensive war. The 7 Years' War may not have been super bloody. This is not the 30 Years' War. But what it is expensive. Why is it expensive? Well, simple. It's history's, World War I might be the first world war, but the 7 Years' War is history's first global war. Because remember, it's fought between these European powers, but all these European powers have colonies now because of mercantilism. So the Europeans are fighting in Europe, but they're also fighting in the Americas. They're fighting in Europe, but they're also fighting in Africa and in Asia, right? They're fighting the world over. It's a global war. It is arguably, political scientists quibble about this because we have nothing better to do, that this might actually be officially World War I. The problem is that this is happening before industrialization. This is happening before sort of the modern world that happens. So look at this picture, right? This is a picture of one of the battles of the 7 Years' War. Every coat, every sword, every saddle, every gun is handcrafted, handmade in a manufactory. This is not mass production yet. And so what you end up happening is you have a massive war, but without an economy able to sustain that war. The net result is that while the war is fought between England and France, England may have won the day, but they both lose. They both leave the war fundamentally bankrupt. No money. It is this event that causes both the French and the American Revolution. Okay? They're intertwined. Now, I have talked about American Revolution and War of Independence. And I'm kind of using these terms interchangeably. I would argue that I shouldn't. Because while it is true that the American War of Independence is the first example of Enlightenment politics in action, and I mentioned that you don't need to go farther than the books on the shelves of our founding fathers. We have their libraries. We know what they're reading as they're writing the Constitution. They're reading the Enlightenment texts. Hobbes is something that they read. We didn't talk about it in this class, but if you do a poli-sci class here at Montclair or anywhere that you're taking this class, Locke might be someone that they were reading as well. Not so much Rousseau, because he was a little too foofy for them, but Locke for sure and Hobbes for sure. And we think that they were probably reading not so much on the day of the revolution, but in the years after, not to get so U.S. history, but like in the period between the Articles of Convention and the ratification of the Constitution, they probably would have read Adam Smith as well. So we know what they're reading. They're consuming the text of the Enlightenment the same way you guys were consuming the text of the Enlightenment. But I'm hesitant to say American Revolution, even though I include it in my unit on revolutions. Because in order to do that, we have to have a broader conversation about what a revolution actually is. And what is a revolution? In mathematical terms, a revolution is literally when you go a circle and go all the way around and right back where you were. Maybe that's a revolution. I would like to highlight something of a question. Because in this class, we have looked at the Protestant Reformation in a video lecture not too different than this one. So what's the difference between a Reformation and a revolution? What makes these two concepts fundamentally different? Because on its face, they seem very similar. I mean, why don't we call what Martin Luther did in Europe the Protestant Revolution? What's different? I was thinking about this. And here's sort of the definition that I came up with. In a word, a reformation is an ideological change. But it's not about affecting the structures of a society, either in a country or in multiple countries. So let's look at the Protestant Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation forced an ideological change in the church. The church had to embrace the Counter-Reformation. The church had to change its behavior. What the Protestant Reformation didn't do is get rid of the Pope. What the Protestant Reformation didn't do is get rid of the nobility. Fundamentally alter what feudalism was or looked like, right? Maybe that the anger at feudalism may have incited the Protestant Reformation, but it's not like Martin Luther was out here saying, fuck the king, fuck the Pope, get rid of everyone, right? No, that's not what's happening. The papacy stays in place. I mean, he may have said fuck the Pope, but you get me, right? After the Protestant Reformation was done, the Catholic Church was still in charge and was still run by the same group of people. What changed was how those people perceived their power to work, what they could and couldn't do. It changed the rules of the game, but it didn't change who got to play the game. A revolution, as you might have guessed, is the reverse. In a revolution, you see structural change, but not necessarily ideological change. It's not about changing the rules of the game. It's changing who gets to play the game. Okay? So when I say structures, I mean the class system. Remember the window graph that I told you guys to remember because it was going to be relevant? This is what I mean. Our window graph of workers, traders, peasants, and nobles. All right? Rural and urban, rich and poor. And what you do when you track a revolution is you sort of look at the graph and say, okay, before the revolution, which group is in charge? It's the nobility. Are they still in charge after the revolution? No. Cool, then we had a revolution. Are they still in charge after the revolution? Yes. Okay, our revolution maybe wasn't all that. Got it? That's kind of how I would encourage you to sort of look at this. And that's sort of been my metric of understanding the difference. Like, if I really wanted to define revolution. And not for nothing, we're going to look at him later today. This is sort of the metric that Barrington Moore uses, whose readings you had to do for technically last class, but we're going to look at them today. Now, when we try to apply the window graph to the American colonial setting, we kind of run into some issues. Because if you try to transpose our window graph to the American setting, the rural environment the urban environment will transition rather neatly. The relationship between worker and trader in London and worker and trader in Boston isn't fundamentally different. It's not fundamentally different, right? Someone is selling their labor and their time, and someone is purchasing that labor and time to produce stuff to sell for profit. Okay? The difference is in the rural environments. Because in Europe, you had a rural environment that was still, even going into the 17th and 18th centuries, dominated by feudalism. Maybe not the kind of feudalism that we had looked at way back when, but still fundamentally, it is the relationship between lord and peasant. The problem is, we don't have lords in America. There was no barons or dukes or earls that crossed the Atlantic to set up shop in the New World. You didn't have fiefs in the New World. You didn't have feudal-style farms in the New World. This is true the up and down the continent, right? North America, Central America, South America, Caribbean. In no place did you find that kind of relationship between lord and peasant. And so you don't have a nobility in the colonies. But if the nobility is in charge in Europe, who's in charge in the colonies? Let's call this hypothetical group of people our colonial governors. Those people, empowered by the crown, be it Spain or Portugal or England or France or Holland, it doesn't matter. Let's just call them colonial governors, people who are tasked with the administration of the colonies. And let us ask ourselves, to which group of people, to which class are our colonial governors most likely to belong to? Well, if the rural environment is still where the power is, we should ask ourselves, what kind of rural environments dominate in the New World? And maybe some of you have already gotten to the answer that I'm trying to get at here, but if it wasn't clear, I'm talking about plantations. I'm talking about plantations. The colonial governors are fundamentally part of the plantation owning class. The planter class. Let's call them the planter classes. Not those who own fiefs, not those who own castles, those whose money is made on plantation, in the production of cash crops. Cash crops. And so if you try to make a window graph, at least for the rural environments of the Americas, what you would get is something that looks like this. So on the one side, for your rural rich, you would have this new group of people, the planters, the plantation owners. And as for the impoverished people, the poor, the rural poor, well, this would be bisected rather neatly. Because on the one hand, you would have free, pioneer, small-scale farmers setting up shop in the rural environments that they are forcibly taking from Native Americans. Low, small-scale farmers. But I think on the other hand, the vast majority at this moment in time are people held in bondage. The rural poor are not peasants in the New World. They are enslaved individuals. So, we need to give these planters a name. And for this, we go to Barrington Moore. Barrington Moore refers to these individuals by a name. He calls them in the most generic way possible. Landed elites, or elites with land, essentially. And the idea is, these are your sort of wealthy class in strictly colonial settings. Because technically speaking, the nobility are also landed elites, right? They're elites with land. But we wouldn't call them that in Europe, because that's just the nobility. When I say landed elites, I'm referring to the colonial setting specifically. So what do we know about the landed elites? Well, for starters, there's one thing that you get from owning a plantation is money, right? Landed elites are wealthy. Well, you also get a spot in hell, but that's a different story. They're wealthy, sometimes obscenely wealthy. Number one. Number two, there is a race divide. There's a race gap in the class relationship because landed elites are almost exclusively white. There are some exceptions, predominantly on Spanish encomiendas, where you would have individuals that would be cataloged as mestizo. Today we would refer to them as mixed race individuals. And that's not the Spanish being hyper progressive here. Oh yeah, cool. Now non-white people can also join in on the oppression. I would like to highlight, how do you think mixed race members of landed elite families came to be? Like, really think about that. That's probably what's going on here, right? Regardless, they're their children. What do the plantation owners own? Well, large amounts of land. And as a byproduct of that, large amounts of slaves. And the patriarchy be patriarching. they are all men. So they're rich, white, landowning, slave-owning men. Rich, white, landowning, slave-owning men. How did that get here? I didn't put that here. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been hacked. I have been hacked by someone who is trying to do some very insightful social commentary here. Because if you take Barrington Moore's ideas and you sort of look at them, and then you apply them to the context of what we call the American Revolution, what you find is that the same class of landed elites are in charge before 1776 and after 1776. And so what kind of a revolution was this? If the founding fathers belonged to the same social class as those colonial governors that they are replacing. Right? It doesn't make a ton of sense. The main argument that Barrington Moore is making is that the American Revolution was not a revolution. Just anecdotally, let me look at, for example, the earliest drafts of the Constitution. There is an attitude in this country that claims that the Constitution is like a divinely perfect document that James Madison brought down from the heavens like Jesus, right? And that's just not accurate at all. The Constitution has undergone several revisions, and the earliest sort of drafts, the earliest first attempts at a Constitution were pretty strict about who got to vote, because voting was restricted to white men of property. Rich white men. And under those rules, I would stake a claim that most of you would not have been able to vote, right? Unless, the few, Caucasian individuals, men watching this are secretly lottery winners that I don't know about, right? I think most every person watching this probably wouldn't have been able to vote in 1777. In fact, universal white male suffrage would only be a thing starting in the 1820s. Universal suffrage would only be a thing starting with the suffrage movement just before World War I. So, what are we seriously talking about here? Where is the revolution in all this? Well, Moore says that there was a revolution. It's just not the War of Independence. There is a revolution in American life that profoundly shifted how American society worked, that profoundly changed how we understood ourselves and which group of people got to be in charge. And it's not the American Revolution. It's not the event we call the American Revolution. For Barrington Moore, it's the Civil War. Because as a major consequence, what does the Civil War do? Gets rid of slavery. Or, put simply, removes the source of their power. The landed elites become no longer relevant in American life in the long term. The reason why on your midterm there was that question where I ask you about Senator Calhoun and that conversation that he has with the president during Amistad. I picked that scene for a reason. And the reason is that in that speech that he gives, where he essentially is threatening the president with civil war, he says, if you to get rid of slavery, you will completely disempower the American South and the main source of its revenue. You will disempower the landed elites that live in the American South, because the landed elites that live in the American South are all slave owners. That's what he's saying. And he's right. The only difference is, so what? Right? I would argue, right? Yeah, correct. That's what we're doing. Who gives a shit? But that's the argument. That's the claim. So, Moore says that that's what the Civil War did. And it changed American life so utterly that it caused a profound shift in where power was. So if you will indulge me, no cheating, let's play a little game. I want you to keep the tab open on this. Put your phones away. No cheating. No cheating. Look, I'm going to follow my own rule. All right? No Googling, no nothing. Can you name me one president, one, between Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt? The whole late 1800s. One president. Name me one. Oh, wait. I'm thinking about it. You probably, statistically, can't do it. Because it's like a gap in presidents you know, presidents you recognize, right? James, so usually you get three. Usually I get three. I get Grant, Polk, Rutherford B. Hayes, or Johnson. Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson, right? But these are all famous for like other reasons. Grant is famous for being a Civil War general, not for anything he did as president. Rutherford B. Hayes is famous for, in a word, selling black people down the river during Reconstruction. Polk was famous for getting shot. Was that shot or pneumonia? One of the two. And Johnson is famous for being impeached. But if I asked you to say, like, what's something like Polk did as president? What's something James Garfield did as president? You can't tell me. What about William McKinley? Right? Weird. But from this same period of time, y'all know who Rockefeller is. Rockefeller is a name you recognize. Andrew Carnegie, that's a name you recognize. Stanford, that's a name you recognize. Power shifted out of Washington, D.C. and into the big cities, into the urban elite class. And during this era of American history that we refer to as the Gilded Age, that's where power resided. And it would stay there, not for nothing. In a few weeks, you guys have to watch a great little movie that I thought I would hate and I ended up really liking, called The Current War. It's all about the story of Thomas Edison and Westinghouse sort of competing at the height of the Industrial Revolution. And you can really, really see that this is like the epicenter of American life during this moment in time. Not Washington, though. Washington remains a backwater pretty much until Teddy Roosevelt does some trust busting and sort of wrests power back to Washington. But that's what it would take. It would take the progressive era for things to change, for things to be fundamentally different. And so, according to Moore at least, the true American Revolution was the American Civil War. But the American Civil War is fought over a very unique line. That window graph, cards on the table, is not my invention. It's Moore's invention. And when Moore looks at the quadrants of the window graph, what he notices is that those lines that divide the classes are not just sort of mathematical quadrant lines. They're fault lines in society, along which revolutions are fought. In the case of the American Revolution, the real American Revolution, that war is fought along the urban-rural divide. The urban classes, rich and poor, fighting the rural classes, rich and poor. And what Moore discovers is that, hey, actually, almost every revolution is like this. It's not like the British Revolution is different. The American Revolution is Union versus Confederacy. The British Civil War / Revolution, parliamentarians and royalists. And the French Revolution, as we're going to see, Jacobins and monarchists. It's the same sort of divide over and over and over and over and over again. And he says, that's interesting. Does every revolution fit this category? And the answer is no. What he says is that this is one path to what he calls the modern world. I want you to imagine, hop into your hot tub time machine, and you go to 3 places. You go to Rome, 1930s, height of fascism. You go to Moscow, 1950s, height of communism, height of Stalinism. 1930s. Stalin has died in 50. So let's put 1930s. Same year in Russia. And then we'll take this hot tub time machine, same year, New York City. Maybe 1929, just before the crash. Great Gatsby era. What you would find is societies that more or less operate, regardless of the political differences, are roughly operating on the same rules of a mass society, of a mass urban industrialized society. But the way they got there is incredibly different. He says there's one group of countries that take the democratic capitalist route to this moment in time. These are the countries that experience revolution in the way I just described. Urban classes versus rural classes, with the urban classes reigning supreme. Okay? Combining Enlightenment economics from Adam Smith with the politics of the nation state to get essentially this. But that's not the only route to the modern world. He describes a route to the modern world experienced by Japan, Italy, and Germany, in which you didn't see an urban-rural divide, but what you saw was that the urban elites allied themselves with the landed elites to form a system that was capitalistic, but not democratic. Fascism. At its core, that's what fascism is. It's capitalism without democracy. In fact, if you look at a context that for world history class we're gonna look at later, when we look at Japan later on in this class, we're gonna talk about the Meiji Restoration. And during the Meiji Restoration, the Emperor of Japan went to his noble houses, the samurai houses of Japan, and basically asked them to go private. It is your national duty to your country to start businesses. And so they do. You've probably asked yourself this at one point in your life. Why a company like Yamaha manages to make designer pianos, DJing equipment, and motorcycles? Right? If you've ever asked yourself that, wait, what? Why does Yamaha make all of these things? The reason is that Yamaha, and a lot of companies like it, Mitsubishi is another one, are a whole series of companies that are originally samurai companies that were founded during the Meiji Restoration by nobility that went private during the era of Japanese fascism. By the way, the reverse can also be true when the poor classes align themselves with each other. Urban poor and rural poor. What you get is the route that we saw, less in Russia, but more in China. A route to the modern world featuring communism, the communist route to the modern world. And China took a different path than we did. But today, in 2024, China is in a not too dissimilar spot to where we are. If you get on a plane today and you go to Shanghai, you will find a country that maybe is different at the margins, but fundamentally lives and operates by the same rules that our society does. They've reached modernity, essentially. They've reached that urban mass society. That makes sense? Okay, I'm going to assume that that's a yes. So, what I'm going to do is wrap up this one on the American War of Independence, which is a lot more theoretical than perhaps you expected. what I'm going to do is I'm going to close. There we go. Close you out. Boom. And I am going to open up the French Rev. World 2 and French Revolution. Where are you? Here you are. Come on. Come on. There. Oh, no, that's the PDF. That's not the one I need. You're the one I need. Come on. Shazam. People are waiting. My people need me. You can do it. I believe in you. Come on. There it goes. Alrighty. Play. Slideshow. Boom. 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 That's not right. Hold up. What's going on here? No. Come here. Hold up, guys. One more. There we go. Movie magic. Move over, Kevin Feige. See? This is video editing. This is art. Anyway. So. Oh, no. Let me make you a bit smaller. Go back. There we go. Much better. Oh, hold up. Now you're too small. Sorry. One of these days, this will work first try, but today is not that day. Perfection. Actually, it's cutting my face off a little bit, but that's okay. So. Let's talk about what happens in France right around the same period of time. We actually have to go back a little bit. All the way back to 1648. Treaty of Westphalia. Now, something I said in passing in our Treaty of Westphalia class is I said that Henry Kissinger, in this, I still kept it around, talks about Cardinal Richelieu as the author of the Treaty of Westphalia. Richelieu is French. One of the great ironies of history is that when Richelieu comes home with the Treaty of Westphalia in hand and says, "My king, we have a new system. Here you go. I did all of this for you." The French monarch isn't happy with Cardinal Richelieu. It turns out that Cardinal Richelieu would have preferred, the French monarchy would have preferred to keep their power and privilege. And so during the 17th and early 18th century, the French monarchy embraces a new concept. They call it absolutism, an absolute monarchy. Put simply, instead of disentangling monarch from state, to put all the powers of the government, sort of to de-delegate the powers of government back into the king, to disempower the nobility and put their authority back in the king, to make the king this ultimate sort of power, and to make the government and the king attached at the hip in almost a more unhealthy way. Louis XIV, who you see here, would famously proclaim in French, I think to Cardinal Richelieu, quote, "L'État c'est moi. I am the state. Me, personally, individually. The state is me. It is represented by me." I think that's important to note because I need you to get the mentality of the French monarchs. Now, what about France? What does it actually look like? Well, France has a few really large cities. Paris, Bordeaux, Marseille, to a lesser extent Lyon during this period of time. And then fields. Essentially, I want you to forget American-style cities. Because in American cities, you have the city center, And then you have miles of suburbia that eventually fizzle out and lead to rural environments. That's not what's going on in France. Instead, the city ends at the city wall and it just stops. And from then on out is just farmland. Okay? So Paris is surrounded not by acres of suburbs like it is today, but by acres of farms. So the city is super urban, super, hyper localized. And there's not that middle ground. It is either the division between urban and not urban is really stark. It's a really stark contrast between the two. That division between classes in France isn't just a much more distinct class distinction, economically speaking. But in France, what's different is that the class distinctions are legally defined. Your class was considered to be an unchangeable part of you, no different than your height or your eye color or the color of your skin. It was just a part of your identity, unchangeable. To want to change your class, your station in life, was considered at best gauche and at worst outright illegal. It was not done. It was just not done. So, already, I'm painting the picture of an environment, of a society that is a lot less healthy than the one, listen, for all of its warts, going into the American Revolution, the Brits had their revolution. They had gotten that out of their system. British society, going into the 7 Years' War at the very least, was somewhat healthy. You can't say the same about France during this period of time. And then the 7 Years' War hits. France spends all of this money, all of this. What? Sorry, I'm getting an error message. What's going on? Okay. Let me know if you guys are having trouble following along. I'm getting a weird error message saying that it's not enough bandwidth. But if you guys can hear me fine, I'm just going to continue. Regardless, France, already an unhealthy society, sort of goes into the 7 Years' War. At the very least, the British won the 7 Years' War. The French can't even claim that. The French fully lost the 7 Years' War and bankrupted themselves in the process. And the 7 Years' War is an example of more than just, hey, here's what happens when society doesn't do well in a time of war. Let me ask you a simple question. How do you think the thinkers of the Enlightenment would deal with the concept of absolutism? Like, think about it. The thinkers of the Enlightenment are super logical people. How would they approach absolute government? How would they approach kings inheriting their power? They would take issue with it. Not so much because it's immoral or wrong. They would take issue with it because it's illogical and stupid. Because, listen, here's the fundamental problem with monarchies, which is why so few countries are monarchies today. Let's say I'm the king. Right? And I'm doing everything right. I'm goated. I am, Super Saiyan Blue Gogeta and Sparking Zero. I'm the best character in the game. Right? That's me right now. What happens when I die? Power goes to my son. Do we have any guarantee that my son will be a good ruler? No, it's luck of the draw. My son could be smart, could be diligent. My son could also be dumber than a box of hammers. I don't know that, right? You don't know that either. We're just going to roll those dice and see what happens. And so this is the problem. I'm sorry. This is the problem with monarchy, fundamentally. The problem with monarchy, fundamentally, is that there's no sort of built-in mechanism to deal with bad monarchs, to replace someone who is not good at their job. I mean, there is. It's murder. That's the solution to bad kings, is to have them suffer unfortunate accidents and then get rid of them. But if you can't, you're kind of stuck with the bad king, no matter the consequences. And France experiences exactly this during the 7 Years' War. It's almost like a perfect storm is hitting France all at once. That poor monarch has a name and a face. His name is Louis the 15th. Now listen, a lot of the blame for the French Revolution is put on Louis the 16th, his grandson, and a lot of those criticisms are valid. But I put a lot on the doorstep of this guy, Louis the 15th. He's the best sort of example that I can think of to show you why monarchies are just not good as a system of government. So what does he do? What does my peak of intelligence Louis the 15th do? Louis the 15th enters the 7 Years' War. He wasn't in the 7 Years' War. He actively decides that he wants to join the 7 Years' War to take the Ohio Valley from the British. And here's what Mr. Bright over here does. You ready for this? He says, oh, well, England is an island. So what I should do is put my army on ships and just sail to England and see what happens. Now, if you know anything about history at all, at any point in your life, what is like the one thing the Brits are good at other than imperialism, right? It's not dentistry. It's not cuisine, right? If the Brits are good at one thing, it's navy. If Great Britain was a Ken, their name would be boat, right? Their name would be boat. So I just want to highlight that. I want to point out that this is fundamentally a really bad plan, a really bad idea. So much so that, Louis the 15th, loses his navy completely. Just kaboof, poof, they're gone. The Brits show up, sink the French ships and the soldiers on board, and Louis the 15th finds himself with no ships and no men and loses the war. The big brain time. And so he's lost the war. Well played, Louis. Now what? Well, now Louis has to figure out what to do, what to tell his people. Like, when you were a kid and you broke something and you had to go tell your parents, like, Mom, I'm sorry, I broke the TV, right? Like, that's kind of Louis in this moment. Only he's the king and he has to tell everyone. So what does he do? He says, people of France, we are unfortunately without money. We need to cut government spending. That means that times will be tough, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. We will all tighten the belt. The thing is, he says we will all tighten the belt. Everyone except him. Because Louis the 15th is basically telling his people, I am comfortable with you starving for a little bit. Whilst being, and I'll be kind, because I don't want to, it's 2024, fat shaming is not cool. But he's not exactly a fitness model. Let's just call it that. I mean, listen, this portrait of Louis the 15th is a flattering portrait. My man's big. He's a big guy. Telling a group of starving peasants that they need to starve for a little bit for the health of France. That goes about as well as you think it goes. In fact, Louis XV, at the height of the crisis in France, would hold some of the most lavish parties of human history, Gatsby-esque parties, on the public dime while his people starved, just outside. This is Louis XV. And it gets better. I have an assertion. This is a personal pet theory of mine about monarchies. Monarchies run on prestige. Monarchies need prestige to function. Because the only way you or I or anyone will accept monarchy as like a system of government is if you accept that the king is better at being king than you are. And in order for that to happen, you need prestige. And so if there is a crisis of prestige of the monarchy risks collapse. This crisis of prestige happens ahead of at least 3 major revolutions. Now, we just talked about the American Revolution before. Anyone know what was wrong with George III, King of Great Britain, during the American Revolution? Anyone actually know? And put in the chat if you do. No? George III was mentally ill. Like extremely mentally. He cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He suffered from a condition that made him prone to fits. And when I say fits of rage, I mean there are rumors that George III liked to chew on the legs of furniture at Buckingham Palace. Like on the chair legs and stuff, in the fit of his rage. And during the American Revolution, he was said to have had a lot of fits of rage. Crisis of prestige, revolution followed. The head of the Russian Revolution, we're going to talk about Grigory Rasputin, a con man, essentially cheating the Tsar and the Tsarina out of money, power, influence, and literally a place at the royal palace. And in this case, what's Louis XV's problem? Well, Louis XV suffers from a problem that many wealthy men of power and influence suffer from. And that is a chronic inability to keep it in his pants. Louis XV is a notorious philanderer. He would spend his days bestowing, let's just call them royal blessings, on the many women, often married women, of Paris and Versailles. To be clear, this is not an SA situation. This was all consensual. But he's still fundamentally cheating on his wife. And when you're doing it to this degree, you might end up with a whole bunch of happy little accidents. And that's exactly what happens to Louis. Louis XV fathers royal bastard after royal bastard after royal bastard constantly. And the thing is, many of these women are not wealthy. They're poor at a time of chronic instability in France. So it's not like they can afford to take care of this royal blessing that the king has given them. They can barely feed themselves. So what did these women often do? They'd show up at the gates of the palace, kid in hand, and would say, "Hey, Louis, this one is yours. Here you go." And not for nothing, the kid would look just like the king too. So the king couldn't even credibly deny it. It's publicly embarrassing. Crisis of prestige. Now remember how I said that monarchies are really, really bad because you can't get rid of a bad king except for murder? The reason why I said that is because they try that. The guy who tries it, his name is Robert Francois Damiens. Henceforth, we will call him Bobby Frank. Please don't actually put that in your midterms. But it's just easier to call him Bobby Frank. And Bobby Frank here is a civil servant. Is a civil servant working for the French government who just, for lack of a better word, gets sick of the king's shit. He just gets sick of it. He doesn't want to deal with the king anymore because the king is just bad at his job and therefore makes Bobby Frank's job harder. And so he says, he sort of steels himself and says, I'm going to do it. Today's the day. I'm going to bring a knife to work and I'm just going to kill the king. So he does it. He sneaks a knife into work and patrols the palace waiting to find the king alone. And sure enough, he does. He finds the king alone in a corridor. And so he says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And he grabs the knife and he stabs the king. The sound effects really make this, I know. And just stabs the king. And fails. Now you might be wondering to yourself, how do you fail at stabbing someone? You take the sharp end and you stick it in there. It's not rocket science. How did you get this wrong, Bobby Frank? Well, it's not Bobby Frank's fault. You see, earlier that day, the king arose from his royal slumber, fashionably late, and moseyed his way on over to the royal wardrobe and opened the royal closet doors and found so much choice of royal attire. Coats and petticoats and shorts and pantaloons and shirts and all these things. Oh, Lord, what will I wear? And struck with royal indecision, Louis XV decides to wear all of it. To put on literally as much of it on his body as he could. You know that one episode of Friends where Joey wears all of Chandler's clothes? Like that, but unironically. Like that. Puts on shirt and t-shirt and sweater and puts everything on. So, a couple hours later, when Bobby Frank takes his knife and tries to stab the king, King is wearing so many layers that the knife gets caught and doesn't even break the skin. I swear to God. This is one of the stupidest stories I've ever heard. But it's real. This is how Louis XV survived. And so he looks down at this knife sticking out of him and looks back up and is like, "Excuse me, can I help you?" Bobby Frank has a distinction. He is the last man in France to have been drawn and quartered. And it is spooky season, so if you want to find out what that is, go Google it. I'm not going to describe it. It's gnarly, though. My point is that Louis XV would not die of unnatural causes. Louis XV would rule France until, I believe, 1781. Also known as too late. Damage is done. Like, at this point, when Louis XV dies, France is gonna have a revolution. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And sure enough, when his grandson, Louis XVI, the creatively named Louis XVI, takes power, it's too late. What's he gonna do? How is he gonna fix the situation, really? Louis XV has made such a hole that Louis XVI is not going to be able to do really anything here. But Louis XVI is smarter than his grandfather in one key way. He's just smart enough to know he's not smart, if that makes sense. Like, he's just smart enough to know that he's in over his head. That he doesn't quite know what to do and how to handle it. And so he does something unprecedented. I'm sorry, you guys. You know I'm live streaming. Stop it. Do not disturb. Anyway. He's just smart enough to know he's not smart. So what he does is something unprecedented. Something that had only been done in French history twice before in times of literal invasion. You see, the French government had a system. It's an in case of emergency break glass system called the Estates General. The idea was the reason why class in France was legally classified was that you could be invited on a moment's notice to help your government in a time of crisis. 100 delegates of each of the three estates would be invited to the palace. And essentially the king would delegate the decision of what to do to this conference, essentially. We're going to make a political government decision by committee, and I will agree to abide by it. And so, Louis XVI calls forth the Estates General. 300 people arrive at the Palace of Versailles to help the king make a decision. And the king publicly announces that he would listen, but not participate in the Estates General Conference. That he would take under advice and agree to do what the Estates General recommended. Again, I would argue already an improvement. So who are these three estates that are invited to the Estates General? Well, here they are. Estate number one is the clergy. Estate number one, right here, right here, is the clergy. Estate number two is the nobility. And estate number three, everybody else. A group collectively called the Third Estate. An undefined mass of humanity representing, that are made up of the urban rich, the rural rich, and the rural poor. Peasants, workers, and traders. All represented by the Third Estate. So here's that structure. Here's what that looked like. The goal of the conference was to solve the political crisis. But they face a problem. They face actually a couple problems. Number one is that this is fundamentally unfair. The Third Estate represents about 97 to 98% of French people and gets 1/3 of the votes. Whereas the clergy and the nobility are just about 2% of the population. 3 if you want to be generous. And they get 2/3 of the vote. Because, spoiler, the clergy and nobility agree on fundamentally every issue. They agree on everything. So what ends up happening is, every time it comes to a vote, it's a tyranny of the majority situation, where the Third Estate would agree to something, and they would be overruled by clergy and nobility, or vice versa. Every single time. They're outnumbered on everything. So what do? Well, for starters, the Third Estate delegates approach the king and ask for a change in format. They say, listen, this format's not working. You're not going to get a good solution here, because what ends up happening is they're just going to pick things that go against our interests specifically, and then because they outnumber us 2-1, that thing gets passed. And so you're not going to get a real solution. You're going to get an easy solution. A solution that doesn't affect the nobility in any meaningful way. We'd like you to double our amount of delegates. We would like to have 200 delegates, so that they have 200 collectively, we have 200 collectively, and we are going to have to compromise and hash out a real decision. The king says no. The king doesn't need a fair solution. The king doesn't need an equitable solution. He needs a quick solution. A solution that works in his mind, number one. Number two, he needs it fast. The fact that the deck is stacked against the Third Estate isn't a bug, it's a feature. Right? That's the point. The point is that to get a solution in and out as quickly as possible, and it's a win-win for the king. Because if the solution works, the king looks like the magnanimous king that listened to his people. And if the solution doesn't work, he can say, well, what do you want? It was their decision. Take it out on the nobility. Right? It's a win-win for the king. And so he refuses. Faced with this scenario, the delegates of the Third Estate do the only rational thing they can think of doing. They leave. Why would you stay? Why would you waste your time? Why would you stay at this conference where your vote literally doesn't matter? And what they're talking about will affect you personally. The solution right before the Third Estate delegates leave, the one that's gaining the most traction, is a government seizure of bakeries to redistribute bread to the needy, to the starving. Now you might be thinking to yourself, actually, that sounds pretty based. That's right, unless you own the bakery. If you own the bakery, that's very much not a good solution for you. And lots of delegates of the Third Estate were business owners. They took issue with this. So they leave. They leave, they abandon the conference. And then, a minor thing, but it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, I think. If I had to point to a moment where maybe this didn't have to go the way that it did, as the delegates leave, when the last one leaves, the king shuts the door, shuts the gates behind them, and locks them, as if to say, you left, you're not allowed back in. And all that does for these already angry delegates is it confirms to them what they had already secretly feared. That the fix was in. That the compromise wasn't a compromise. That this was just tyranny by another name. And in their anger and in their rage, these delegates decide, pardon my French, pun fully intended, fuck it. We'll make our own conference. And so you have this comical scene where about 100 people, flash mob of humanity, sort of is going through the streets of Versailles, looking for a room, last second, large enough to put 100 people in. They find it eventually in the most unlikely of places. The local tennis court. And it is here that the French Revolution begins, at a tennis court in Versailles, where the 100 delegates of the Third Estate commit to not leaving until they have crafted out an alternative document, an alternative interpretation for the future of France. In a word, one in which, spoiler, the king may or may not be present. That's the start of the French Revolution. The start of the French Revolution has begun. Now the problem is, let's sort of break down French society along our window graph, shall we? I have replaced the word worker and trader with the words that the French would have used. Words you might recognize. Bourgeoisie and proletariat. Right? You probably know these words because they come out of Marx, but Marx doesn't invent the words. These are words that the French are using to describe workers and traders. And they've done so for a long time. Also, side note, I don't know why the peasants are drunk in this slide, but just roll with it, yeah? Anyway, we said the delegates themselves, not the Third Estate as a whole, but those who are speaking for the Third Estate, those who are now at the tennis court, taking the oath, are predominantly members of the bourgeoisie. Because think about it, you needed to be able to read and write and be cognizant about politics. Peasants can't read and write, and the proletariat doesn't read and write. That kind of just leaves the bourgeoisie. And so, it is the urban rich that are sort of spearheading this movement. And we said the French Revolution follows the same line as the American Revolution, which means the bourgeoisie seek help from the proletariat. And that's how we get this. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is to the French Revolution what the Declaration of Independence is to the American Revolution. It is for lack of a better word, a declaration of intent of what they want this to be. It's a compromise. It is an offering that the bourgeoisie can give to the proletarians, essentially saying, fight for us, and this is the world you're fighting for. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. All social distinctions can only be founded on the common good, a specific dig at that legally enforced class system. Article 2. The goal of any political association is the conservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, safety, and resistance against oppression. And if that sounds a little familiar, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like the Declaration of Independence. Correct, a lot of them were reading it before writing this. It is, let's just say, loosely inspired. So we have our ideological framework for a revolution. We have a core sort of group of individuals supporting the revolution. And we have the working class supporting the revolution. The revolution can proceed. And proceed it does. The Bastille is stormed. Now, what is the Bastille is this castle in the heart of Paris. And this is another one of those not very smart decisions by the French monarchy, because the Bastille, this castle in the heart of Paris, is where the French monarchy kept two things: all of the army's guns and all of their political prisoners in the same spot. It would be like if you kept the nuclear codes at Guantanamo Bay. Not your brightest moment. Because what ends up happening is those political prisoners have families. They have siblings. They have spouses. They have children that want to see them free. What is often not mentioned about the storming of the Bastille is that this is a movement predominantly led by women. The storming of the Bastille is led by the mothers, the wives, the daughters of those prisoners kept in the Bastille illegally. And so it begins as we want to free our family from a tyrannical monarch. And it just so happens that in so doing, they're able to they do that, but get all the army's guns. The French Revolution, in terms of strictly the fighting part, lasts about 24 to 48 hours. It's done. It's over. Once they've stormed the Bastille, the army has no weapons. The revolution is won in an instant. The king has to concede. So what happens now? We, bourgeoisie, have been successful. We have kicked the king out of power. The king is alive still, but we have kicked him out of power. Well done. Go team. Now what? Well, now we vote. We said we were going to give people the right to vote, so now we vote. We are going to select a new elected leader. The first elected leader of France is a name you might recognize. His name is Maximilien Robespierre. And we will run the full gamut of emotions on Robespierre. Because Robespierre will go from hero to villain real quick. Real quick. But Robespierre is a hero of the revolution. And he is sort of the consensus candidate. He is the candidate that both the proletariat and the bourgeois can kind of agree on, saying this is the guy. But almost immediately, once Robespierre takes power, it turns out that a lot of the promises made, they didn't want to keep them. They weren't super thrilled. Like, really? We're going to give the unwashed masses the right to vote? I want the right to vote. They shouldn't have it. And so, the policies start to reverse. The bourgeoisie begins to promote policies that cement their own political power, as opposed to sort of liberalizing it. For example, we know that one of the first proposals made is a changing in how the National Assembly works. The National Assembly is to the French Revolution what Congress is to the American government. And every 2 years, one of the big features of the House of Representatives is that every 2 years, every member of the House is up for re-election. Every single one, 100%. In the National Assembly, they changed the rules so that only a third were up for election at any given time. Why? Because if Robespierre's party was blown out of the water, they would still have 2/3 of the vote. That was the argument. The argument was that this keeps our control safer. And just to be safe, we're also going to restrict voting to those individuals with property. Sound familiar? We just talked about that. which means that most of the proletariat could not vote in the revolution they fought for. Now, you may notice this term here, sans-culotte. I've included that intentionally because in addition to sort of taking advantage of the working class people, during these years, an unflattering nickname is plastered on them. Sans-culotte is a French term meaning, quote, without pants. Without pants. Literally, not wearing any. The argument was that the poor people of Paris were so poor that they could not afford trousers. That's how poor they were. They were sans-culotte, the poorest of the poor. Who cares if they fought for us? Who cares if they died for us? They're sans-culotte. We shouldn't give them the right to vote anyway. They're dirty. We don't know. That's the attitude. Now, this is sold as the revolution is new. We need a stable system. You will get these rights back when the revolution is done. And if you've gathered where I'm going with this, the when the revolution is done is a loophole so large you could drive a Ram truck through it. Because the argument becomes, well, the revolution isn't over. What do you want? When the revolution is over, you'll get your rights. But the revolution isn't over. We are surrounded by enemies, without and within. Those who want nothing better than to destroy our revolution. So, if we're serious about the French Revolution, we need to purge these enemies within. And so, hot new invention is pulled out of the attic. The guillotine. Now, the guillotine had been invented before, but it was not really popular until the French Revolution. But the French Revolution views the guillotine as a humane and egalitarian way to do public execution. It also helped that the guillotine could have an execution be done over and over and over and over again, like a production line of death. Why? Because this allowed the people in charge to tell the people of Paris that the revolution was ongoing, that they were getting rid of enemies. And who were these enemies? Why, the nobility, of course. All to gain the consensus of the proletariat. This is the Great Terror, as they call it. This is what it was done for. Not by sort of my admission, by Robespierre's admission. Robespierre keeps a diary, and we have it. All right? Robespierre, this is an intentional, this is not belief. This is politics. Robespierre is playing the political game, trying to keep the crowd on his side, because while the crowd is on his side, he can kind of do what he wants. And Robespierre reveals some less than savory tendencies during this period of time. So, how does the nobility respond? Because the nobility, I mean, listen, up until this point, this has been cute. This has been adorable. They think they have rights. They think they're going to have themselves a revolution. Please, we, the nobility, are in charge. We're the ones actually in charge. And now, well, now they're coming for us. Now we are being executed, and we can't let this fly. And so, if in the time of need, the bourgeoisie approached the proletariat and asked for help, it would stand to reason that the nobility approached the peasantry and asked for help. These godless heathens in the city are upending the natural order of things. And it's up to you, peasants, to stop it. How? Simple. Stop. Stop working. This whole scenario began. the end of the 7 Years' War because people didn't have enough food. Right? People were starving. There was a bankruptcy. This is why Louis XV was so hated. During the Estates General, they're talking about how to solve the economic crisis, specifically regarding starvation. What happens if the peasants stop working? What little food there is dries up. And that's what the nobility are counting on. The nobility are counting on essentially breaking the relationship between bourgeoisie and proletariat. Saying, you proletarians are starving. You guys had it better when we were in charge. Support us instead. To gain the mob on their side. We call this event the War in Vendée. The War in Vendée. I'll actually throw that in the chat. That's Vendée with a little squiggly on the first E. Vendée. This is an armed uprising in the French province of Vendée. Vendée is picked intentionally because it is the breadbasket of Paris. It is the place where most of the food grown goes to Paris. So if Vendée stops working, Parisians don't eat. It's an intentional decision. And one that ultimately ends not well for the peasantry. Because the war in Vendée is put down in blood. It's a massacre. The bourgeoisie sicks the angry mob on the peasants. And the ploy of the nobility fails. The nobility, now faced with no options, does the only thing it can think to do. It runs away. It runs off. It runs off to Austria. Rather famously, King Louis XVI tries to run off right after the war in Vendée. I find that to be, let's just say, not a coincidence, right? That very clearly that there's maybe not a grand conspiracy, but there was an understanding that the war in Vendée was the attempt at getting power back. And when it failed, many nobles decided that discretion was the better part of valor and ran. The king tries to do this too. The only problem is as I mentioned, the king is a moron. The king tries to run away in the royal carriage. It's a lot like Batman trying to be subtle while driving the Batmobile. Like, everyone knows that's your car. Like, you're not fooling anyone. We know it's you. And so, sure enough, the king is stopped on the road basically immediately, dragged back to Paris, and executed. Now, why did all of these nobles go to Austria? Well, rather famously, Marie Antoinette, the let-them-eat-cake lady, never actually said that, but much like with Prima Nocta, it's telling that so many people believed she said it. It's telling of the situation and the disconnect, that people could believe that about Marie Antoinette. Anyway, she's Austrian. Her family is the Habsburg dynasty of Austria. So a lot of the French nobility runs away to Austria, leaving France in something of a pickle. Why? If the nobility is gone, who are we going to execute at the guillotine? And if we have to put the guillotine back in the attic, we have to start giving the we have to start giving the mob the rights that they fought for. And none of us want to do that. And so, France prepares for war. Against everyone. France declares war on the nobility of Europe in this moment. Now, what I find fascinating is this interpretation of events, the French Revolution, as a grand conspiracy of the bourgeoisie and the nobility, both of whom are using the poor classes as pawns to fight each other, is an interpretation of these events provided by one Karl Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. And the minute I said that this came out of Marx's brain, a lot of you just went, oh yeah, that tracks. I can see that. What's fascinating is, though, that's not the only interpretation of the French Revolution. You guys had to read a document for today, a series of selected quotes from two thinkers, Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, who, like Marx, are looking at the same events and coming to dramatically different conclusions. A quick note, though, because when I say Karl Marx, you don't associate that with the French Revolution because you think, oh, Marx comes later. Marx was born in 1818. The French Revolution happens in 1789. He may not have been alive for it, but he's close enough to know what happened. The French Revolution is to Marx what the 80s are to you, right? You maybe didn't live through the 80s, but your parents did, right? There are people alive today that can tell you exactly what happened in the 1980s. You don't need to look that far. And so the argument being made, that I'm making, is that Marx is in a similar vein. He understands the French Revolution. He may not have lived through it literally, but indirectly he did, right? And Burke and Paine are literal contemporaries of the French Revolution, I would highlight. So let's take these in order. What does Burke say of the French Revolution? Well, let's look at who Burke is. For starters, Burke is the father of the modern-day conservative movement. Up until this point, to be conservative in the world meant to be pro-monarchy. That kind of falls out of style. Not neocons in the international relations way of neocons, not the George W. Bush neocons, but like new conservatism after this moment in time, Edmund Burke style conservatism, focuses instead on the concept of stability. What does the government look like before and after the French Revolution? What does society look like before and after the French Revolution? And what Burke takes issue with is not the concepts of the revolution. It's not the ideology of the revolution. It's not even the motivation of the revolution. It's not the why. It's the how. Burke takes issue with the idea that the French Revolution gave people liberty and then didn't give them government. It removed the government and didn't quite replace it. It didn't adequately replace it. He writes, abstractly speaking, government, as well as liberty, is good. I should therefore suspend my congratulations on the new liberty of France until I was informed how it had been combined with government, with public force, with the discipline and the obedience of the armies, with the collection of an effective and well-distributed revenue, with morality and with religion, with the solidity of property, with peace and with order, with civil and social manners. All of these things in their way are good things, and without them, liberty is not a benefit whilst it lasts, and perhaps more importantly, is not likely to continue long. The effect of liberty is that they may do what they please. Maybe first we ought to see what it will please them to do. We should see what these people do with their liberty before we say, well done, congratulations. Burke views liberty akin to fire. He says liberty needs supervision. Liberty needs government oversight, because otherwise it devolves into anarchy. It becomes chaos. And so, without good government, liberty isn't beneficial. It just devolves. Burke looks at the French Revolution and says, look what happens. You guys got rid of the king. You guys got rid of the government. And the whole thing fell to shit immediately. The guillotines and the executions and the mass terror. This is not what you wanted. This is not desirable. Because you gave people liberty. You gave people the right to do whatever they wanted. And it turns out they did whatever they wanted. That's not a good thing. You needed to give good government to France. Then you can give them liberty. Then, once you've established the guardrails, Once you've baby-proofed the house, then you can give people liberty. Not before then. Before then is dangerous. Burke says that's exactly what happens in France. Years later, one Christopher Nolan, director Christopher Nolan, would very openly admit to reading Edmund Burke's writing on the French Revolution when making the third movie in his Batman trilogy. When Bane takes over the city and the whole situation goes to hell. Like, that is very directly inspired by what Burke is writing about the French Revolution. Now, that's Burke. What about Paine? If Burke does not like the revolution, Paine stands the revolution. Paine loves the revolution. He says that the French Revolution is the sister revolution to the American Revolution. And he loves the American Revolution even more. But Paine, I would argue, does point out something that no one else has done up until this point. Paine notices that the French Revolution, politically speaking, didn't happen because people were angry at the king personally. We said that Louis XVI was an improvement over Louis XV. So things were getting better, not worse. So Paine says it's not against the king specifically, because if that were the case, they would just take one king and replace him with another king. No. They take issue with the concept of having a king at all. Specifically, they take issue with that thing that I mentioned all the way at start of class. That monarchies are just not effective systems of government. What he calls primogenitureship. Primogenitureship. The idea that power is inherited. The French Revolution isn't against the king. It's against the concept of having a king. He writes, it's not against Louis XVI, but against the despotic principles of his government that the nation revolted. Now, let me paint you a question. Let me paint you an idea around I can English. English is hard. About primogenitureship. So, I'm teaching this class in October. Summer was over now a couple months ago, but maybe you went somewhere nice this summer. And let's say you took maybe a cheaper airline. Let's say you got on their plane and you sat down in your seat. And on comes the captain. This is your captain speaking. I just want to let you know that I have this job because my father was a pilot. I actually don't know how to fly a plane. We'll just figure it out as we go. Welcome to Spirit. Click. What would you do? You'd get the hell off the plane, right? Because you recognize that the concept of a hereditary pilot is insane, right? The idea that I'm a pilot purely because my father was a pilot and I don't actually know how to fly planes is crazy. In fact, if I say a hereditary blank in front of most jobs, you would say that's crazy. A hereditary doctor, a hereditary dentist, a hereditary everything, right? You would say, that is absolutely insane. Get the hell away from me. I'm not letting you touch my teeth to your hereditary dentist. But the minute I say hereditary king, you nod your head and that sounds about right. You're a king because your father was a king. That makes sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in the exact same way for the exact same reason. Paine writes, the idea of a hereditary legislator is as inconsistent of that of hereditary judges or hereditary juries, as absurd as a hereditary mathematician or a hereditary wise man, and as ridiculous as a hereditary poet. To restore, therefore, parents to their children, children to their parents, relations to each other, and man to society, and exterminate the monster aristocracy, root and branch, The French Constitution destroyed the law of primogenitorship. Paine says, listen, this may not have been clean or nice. It wasn't. But this change was necessary. It was necessary for French society to grow up. Right? Think about it. It's fundamentally childish that you have in a society people cosplaying as lords and ladies in the 1700s. That's wild. In the late 1700s, 30 years removed from the Industrial Revolution. That's crazy. That's insane. And Paine recognizes that. I mean, maybe not the Industrial Revolution part, but he says that's no. Society needs to grow up. And I think a larger point that Paine is making is that the French Revolution may not have been clean or pretty, but maybe it needed to happen. I would even take it a step further. I would say let's look at other revolutions in history. Let's look at the English Revolution. A revolution so bloody and awful that it caused Thomas Hobbes to write a whole book about why people are terrible and need to be controlled. The American Revolution, depending on which interpretation you have, is either A, a war with the British, or B, the bloodiest revolution in American history. But we get upset because during the French Revolution, some nobles were executed, and we clutch our pearls. How could you? Full how dare you meme, full Greta meme. Right? Think about it. If you were taking Paine to his logical conclusion, you could make an argument that the French Revolution is actually the cleanest one of them all in terms of people dead at the end of it. Now, normally, I would wrap up here and move on to Napoleon. But guys, it's 11. I'm tired. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put a pin in this. This is going to be a part 1 of a 2-part series. On tomorrow, when I come back from Seton Hall, we're going to finish part 2 in the same sort of live format at a similar time, I would say. Similar sort of time. And we're going to do Napoleon in Haiti. Okay? Cool? We'll get it done. Sorry, it's going to come up 24 hours late. I'm trying here. All right? Cool? Cool. Guys, it's been a pleasure. I will see you all, hopefully, in class on Friday. Have a wonderful evening, and I will see you when I see you. Cheers.